member in political science. And it's one of my pleasures to host Lightning Lounge with a lot of help, beyond help from Julia Fulgham and Kate Cunningham and Sandy Rodrigue from the Advanced Office, Mary Jo Daniel and Monica Fischel from the Office of Research, and Erin Haney from Center for Teaching and Learning, all of whom help kind of put together the program each time. As usual, we have, let me just say we have forthcoming Lightning Lounge sessions on March 10th and April 14th. So if any of you are interested in signing up, we've got a couple of slots left for each of those Lightning Lounge sessions, March 10 and April 14. As usual, we've got 4 presenters, and they've been asked to make presentations exactly 7 minutes in length, no longer, which leaves time for some Q&A after their presentations. So if you would open your participants list, that's the easiest way to kind of raise your hand and signal that you'd like to join the conversation and ask a question. The presenters will handle their own slides. Presenters, I'm just going to be holding up time reminders to the camera, telling you how many minutes you have left. So we're going to go in kind of counterclockwise order of the way presenters appeared on the poster. So we're going to start with Rebecca Bixby, who is presenting from the Department of Biology, and she is presenting Looking for the Light, the Dynamics of Algae in Arid Land Rivers. Rebecca, the floor is yours. And you are muted.
All right, thanks, Bill, for that introduction. So many of you probably drive over the Rio Grande on a regular basis, or maybe did pre-pandemic. And you may not think about the fact that the Rio Grande is a really critical component of ecosystems in the Southwest. And we're actually really dependent on it as humans too. So today I'm going to talk to you about some of the work we're doing looking at biological organisms and the environmental drivers that shape them in the Rio Grande. And I hope that it lets you look at the Rio Grande in a different light. So my research questions and the work in my lab are often centered at this intersection of biodiversity, ecology, and water resources. We're really interested in water in the Southwest, thinking about the ecological organization at a community and ecosystem level, and we think about patterns over space and time. And often we're thinking about organisms such as the diatoms, which are microscopic photosynthetic algae with cell walls made out of glass. Their specific ecological needs means that we can interpret what the river condition is, and they're also food for things like the Rio Grande silvery minnow. So we're often thinking about food resources in the river. Arid land rivers are interesting in that they have variable flows, high flows and low flows. They're also characterized by high turbidity, suspended sediment from overland erosion, and tributary contributions that sometimes makes the water look like chocolate milk. Because the water is so turbid, the algae has to live in this edge habitat. In a compressed habitat with shallow water, there's actually very little algae that lives in the open water. And as a result of this sustained turbidity, we also have really low light limitation. And so we think about this algal band often at the very edge of the river. We talk about this as the bathtub ring, and it can be compressed like this, or as in last year when the flows were so low, you can see that this band is much more expanded. So it's not a static entity, it really is dynamic over space and time, and that's what we've been working on in the Rio Grande. We've been mapping this bathtub ring, thinking about how it relates to the river with a series of projects that we've been doing. This is methodology we've developed at UNM, where we sample on a transect out from the edge of the river to the middle of the river with a set distance and depth along a transect where we measure water flow, distance from shore, depth, a number of parameters that measure diatoms, and also invertebrate taxa. Our initial work was done at the Los Lunas site, which is a wide, sandy floodplain, shallow waters. And if you look at this initial graph, not a lot of data points, but we have flow velocity on the x-axis, water depth on the x-axis, and we have diatom densities on the y-axis, with sort of a measure of biomass. And what we're interested in is thinking about thresholds. Can we predict where that bathtub ring would be, and where is it either too deep or too fast water-wise for diatoms to be present? And so you can see from this graph, these colors represent different seasons. The green and the orange, April and November, you can see that we really actually have a bit of a threshold at 0.18 meters per second in terms of velocity. And if you look at the depth measurements, you can see that we have about 12 centimeters in depth, and then we really lose all of our biomass. So we have this prediction, and so we took that information and applied it to another project that we have up by the Bernalillo Bridge, Highway 550. This is a different kind of graph. It's actually depth profile. So this is actually the channel of the river changing in depth. And so we have distance, we have water depth from shallow to deep. These are different sites and different transects. These circles represent the diatom density, and the bigger the circle, the higher the density, the smaller the circle, the lower the density. And so our prediction would be that the bigger circles should be at the surface or at the edge of the river, and the deeper we go, the smaller the circles should be. Well, you know, as it happens, it's not exactly rock solid. So if you look at this panel right here, in the blue line, we do have higher densities at the surface and lower densities of diatoms at the at greater depths. But if you look at the red line, that's not true. We have high densities, but we also have high densities at the lower depths as well as the shallower depths. So that leads us to realize that depth is not really the only driver we have for these algal systems. It's really a complex relationship between flow, light, channel morphology. I'd add substrate in here as well, because that Bernalillo site is much more channelized and has a different substrate. Here's one of my idealized graphs, and we're working towards getting the empirical data where we have turbidity, those suspended particles, and light intensity. And if we pick any depth along this line, what's the light availability to support those photosynthesizers, those diatoms? We're working on a project that is really thinking about that right now. Finally, why do we care about this bathtub ring? I alluded to it earlier in that this bathtub ring is a food resource for higher levels of organisms that are grazers, including the silvery minnow. There's a lot of work going on right now to do habitat restoration for the silvery minnow, these backwaters with shallow depths and slow moving water. And they also feed the food resources to make those restoration sites really work. And this is information that we need from our work to support this restoration work that's going on for the silvery minnow. So I hope this is just a little vignette of what we're working on, but I hope you think about this bathtub ring. Maybe not when you're driving over the bridge, because you probably can't see it, but as you're walking your dog in the bosque, think about this cool bathtub ring and how these systems are really developed to support the whole food web. This project's been funded through the Bureau of Reclamation, and I have some phenomenal collaborators and a whole pile of students who've been working on these projects for a number of years, as well as a lot of volunteer field help. And so that's the end of my story for now, and I'm happy to take questions.
Great, thanks, Rebecca. So if we can return the screen to the gallery view, then I'll be able to see hands up, or you can just raise your hands with the little mechanism in the participants list.
I think Mary Jo has a question.
Yeah, Mary Jo, go ahead.
Hey, Becky.
Hey, Mary Jo.
It's a long day, so my camera's off. So, we've invested, or what I've read about, a lot of money in, like silvery minnow habitat restoration. Can we actually manipulate the bathtub ring to ensure there is food resource for these critters?
Yeah, so we're starting to understand essentially the hydraulics, the flows around these restoration sites. And really, we need to be cognizant of the depths and the flows that go through these restoration sites to make sure that those food resources are there. One of the problems that is often plaguing restoration projects is that we don't follow up and do the monitoring. So we don't actually know if what we restored really did the trick. And so we've been really promoting this idea of monitoring these restoration sites as well as being involved in the initial development of the restoration sites.
Thanks.
So this is partly already covered by Mary Jo's question. Do you have some thoughts on how prolonged drought of the kind that we're facing now affects sort of where you see these boundaries, and how quickly can that community that lives in that bathtub, right? How quickly can it migrate if you have a long-term reduction in stream flow?
So last summer we had really low flows and that bathtub ring was huge, but also composed of different species than we normally see there. And so, the low, slow flows with lower turbidity actually might help that bathtub ring. One of the things we're really interested in is, if you have complete dry down, how does that river repopulate itself? And we're kind of keyed in on the ditches and the drains, and acequias is maybe a place where things work as a refugia and then repopulate. So we've been really interested in this idea of what happens when things dry down and what happens when things re-wet and the mechanisms behind that. That's a great question, and I'm really jazzed about that question.
Yeah, I think you're going to get to research that question this coming summer.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah. Okay, any other questions for Rebecca? If not, well, thank you very much. Very interesting presentation. Let's see, next we will be hearing from Maryam Aranjani, professor of law, and her topic is school safety measures jump constitutional guardrails. Maryam.
Thank you so much, Bill. I'm just going to share my screen here. One second here. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Maryam Aranjani. I teach at the law school, and I'm just so thrilled to be part of Lightning Lounge today. And I want to thank a few people. First, my research assistants who've helped me with this work, Nat Sang and Hope Pendleton. I also want to thank my beloved colleague and friend, Sonia Gibson-Rankin, for being such a advocate for participating in things like this for those of us up on North Campus. And I also want to thank my husband, Paul Figueroa, and colleague who has helped me prepare for today. So I chose to share a little bit about this work, and it'll be tough to do in 7 minutes, but I'm looking forward to it and looking forward to your questions, because my main reason really for working on this question of school safety measures and the extent to which they're actually keeping students safe relative to the violations of their constitutional rights, in my view, is one of public importance, great public importance. And so it's one that I'd love to engage in lots of conversations about, and have engaged in lots of conversations about, not as much on our campus as I'd like. So I'm looking forward again to hearing everyone's thoughts. So in this piece, I argue that metal detectors, cameras, embedded law enforcement, threat assessments, restraint and seclusion, and other harsh practices violate students' constitutional rights. So I have a list here of some of the practices that have become pretty commonplace across the country in the last 20 to 30 years. Some of you might be familiar with these practices, and others may not. But I think what's certainly clear in this moment in time is our concerns about racial justice and the extent to which different government systems contribute to the death of Black people and other people of color, but also just to the lack of ability to really fully engage in the ways that they're entitled to under the Constitution. So I argue that, schools have this unique place. They're like the cornerstone of American government, in the sense that almost everybody has some contact with a public school, either directly through their own experience or through their children or other people they know. And so it's really the place, a pivot point of teaching about and expecting people to respect and learn about constitutional values. So I argue we've gone a little bit too far in terms of this idea of safety, which actually has not been proven by the literature. So in fact, intensive surveillance and policing in public schools has not increased student safety. There's really not good evidence of that. And in fact, there's evidence of the opposite, that some of the safety measures I've just described have the opposite effect and make students, again, further funneled into the criminal justice system, that create school climates that are unpleasant and, at the very least, and frankly, dangerous for some kids, including students of color and students with disabilities, who the Department of Education reports are far more likely to be subject to restraint and seclusion, for example, and arrest than white students and students who don't have disabilities. So just in terms of the sense of scale of this problem, in the past 20 years, the Justice Policy Institute has noted that we've spent in the United States about $1 billion putting police in public schools. And those are primarily in schools with majority students of color. So we think that there's a security interest, but there's also a very strong privacy interest in constitutional, values question of what are the rights that are protected of young people. So in this piece, I look at 4 particular amendments to the Constitution, and I look at the case law that the Supreme Court has developed over time in these areas to come to the conclusion that there are strong arguments that the current practices are violating students' constitutional rights. So the 4th Amendment to the Constitution protects us from unreasonable searches and seizures. In the interest of time, I won't get into too much detail about the case law there, but the court, in a nutshell, has said that students do enjoy 4th Amendment protections in schools. They're not quite as great as the protections they would have outside of school. In the 5th Amendment context, there are 2 relevant constitutional provisions. One is the guarantee of due process. So whenever there's a deprivation of life, liberty, or property, the government owes us due process. And so the court has found, again, that does apply in public schools, again, not as robust a way as it applies in other contexts, but still, students are entitled, for example, if they're going to be suspended for more than 10 days, they're entitled to a process whereby they are given notice of the infractions that they've been accused of committing, and they're given an opportunity to be heard, to present their side of the story. There's also in the 5th Amendment, and everyone knows this from all the shows, a privilege against self-incrimination. And I'm seeing that I have 1 minute left, so I'm going to go a little bit more quickly through my arguments here. In the Eighth Amendment context, we have a protection against cruel and unusual punishment, and these practices are violating that. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, the 14th Amendment guarantees equal protection of the law to everyone, and particularly is focused on equality for Black Americans. So the takeaways for my presentation, really, they're just two big ones. The first is I hope to raise awareness about the prevalence of what I call prisonization practices in public schools. And then secondly, to get us thinking about the strong constitutional arguments against these practices today. So I think I finished before 7 minutes. Bill, am I correct?
You did.
Somehow.
I'm impressed. So, yeah, great presentation. Thank you. And just take questions. I bet you're going to get some. Sonia, go ahead.
No, thank you so much for this talk. And I think what stands out to me is that complexity that you showed of the distinction between privacy and security. And we tend to think of schools having the role of parents patria, right? They are doing what we would permit at home. How do we juggle with that when some homes are more strict than others, and kind of weighing that?
That's a great question. Yeah, so the court has acknowledged this concept of in loco parentis, that the schools are acting in the place of parents while children are in school. And that's the theory the constitutional theory under which schools, assert that they have this obligation to keep students safe. And I'm not against evidence-based practices, but I think we should just be conscious of the fact that, for example, I just use New Mexico as a microcosm, and we're not representative of the whole country, but we know that here in New Mexico, the student to counselor ratio is 391 to 1. That's almost twice the recommended ratio. For social workers, 945 to 1, which is almost 4 times the recommended ratio. In terms of school psychologists, we are almost 4,000 to 1. And the recommended ratio is 700 to 1. So those are evident, providing those kinds of sources of support to students are evidence-based ways to keep schools safe. All these practices that I talk about are not. So in my view, yes, the schools have a role to play, but we should hold them to a high standard in keeping our students safe, an evidence-based standard.
Ahranjani, go ahead.
Yes, thank you so much. It's a really great, important topic. I was wondering if you were examining, if any of these arguments also examined the psychological trauma that a lot of the school safety measures may impose on children. And I'm thinking of that in terms of this dearth of counseling. Yes.
Thank you, Erin. That's a wonderful question. And we have a colleague here in New Mexico at New Mexico State, Lisa Peterson, who's a relatively new professor there, who's in the school psychology department. And she and I have talked about that body of research and what, unfortunately, there's not a lot of it. It's very difficult to do research on minors, as you know, and especially in the school setting. There are layers of permissions that need to be done from the schools, from parents, teachers, et cetera. So it's a little difficult to do that research, but there are some indications of exactly what you just described, that it is actually harmful. I mean, if you can just imagine, so I taught in Washington, D.C. for many years, and I had a chance to teach in a lot of different public high schools. I just vividly remember standing in line to get into one high school where I used to volunteer teach. There were, lines of hundreds of students would wait in the freezing cold to get through metal detectors, to get through the armed security guards, only to be confronted in the hallways with cameras that were watching their every move. I don't think this is the kind of environment that we think is, I don't know how much evidence we need to show that that's not a positive learning environment, right? I think it's pretty common sense, but it's a good point. And I think, one Lisa's very interested in studying, I know, and perhaps other scholars as well.
Thank you.
Sure.
Mary Jo, go ahead. What? I think I missed
Sure.
Taylor's. I'm not sure whose hand went. I think two hands went up at the same time. Mary Jo, go ahead, and then Taylor.
Well, you can start with Taylor because I already got to ask one.
Okay, fair. Taylor, go ahead.
Hi, Professor.
Thank you.
I just had a question about if you look at all how like academic outcomes or like the pressure on testing, and then also those types of policies, how that is impacted by like school safety measures. Because I just from my own teaching experience, I think there was such a pressure on like testing outcomes that it almost propelled teachers into investing more time and energy into safety measures because of classroom control. So I just wondered if you looked at that at all.
You know, Taylor, that's an excellent question, and thanks for joining us today. I have not looked into that, and it's certainly the case that in the last 20 years, when these prisonization practices have exploded, that simultaneously we see a focus on testing and you know, a decrease in civics education, for example. You know, there a confluence of factors. And so that would be really interesting to look at. And one of the things I've noticed, there's a 10th Circuit case that I was just rereading last night in preparation for today, AM versus Holmes. For those of you that are not familiar with the case, you should check it out. It's the burping case. You know, we had a student here at Cleveland Middle School who whose PE teacher was not happy with the students, you know, burping in class, and called on the radio for help. I mean, that seems like something, you know, that can be handled without calling for the SRO to come, but the SRO came and charged the student with a, you know, with a criminal offense, and the student ended up getting funneled into the criminal justice system for burping in class. And so I'd like to think that there are organic reasons that teachers need that level of support, and I hope we can address those as well, for sure. But I haven't looked at that link that you just described.
Thanks. Mary Jo, go ahead.
Thank you. This is really interesting. As a former middle school teacher, I've seen some of this, but again, it was many years ago where I think it was perhaps not as big an issue. But I do wonder, have the teacher unions had a stance on this in terms of security versus privacy and all the rest of it?
That's a great question, and thank you for it. I have been in touch. So this work actually came out of some community organizing that I've been doing around, you know, school policing, and I've had an opportunity through that work to work with different teachers unions locally and nationally. And you know, they say that they don't like these practices either. I mean, they say that they, you know, and there are different efforts underway with various levels of urgency by teachers unions to try to advocate for the removal or reduction of school police, embedded school police. But frankly, my view, I don't know. I mean, I'm not a full-time K through 12 teacher, so I can't imagine what the stressors are. But my sense is that there is, you know, just the presence of these factors. The mere presence means that somebody's going to use them, right? So if we're serious about evidence-based ways to help students who have challenges that lead to violence, we really need to think about removing this floor of opportunity for you know, to call people in or to use invasive you know, surveillance tactics, in my view.
Thank you.
Great,
You're
thanks.
welcome.
Todd Quinn just put his hand up. So Todd, last question, go ahead.
Yeah, just a quick question about the difference between, are most of the surveillance and security in city schools versus suburban versus rural schools, and what is how's that, you know, influence everything?
That's an excellent question, Todd. And in a piece that I wrote in 2017 called "The Prisonization of America's Public Schools," I look at that question, and it's mostly urban, minority, low-income schools where the most prisonization practices exist. And you know, one of the points I make in that piece is in tracking the mass school violence episodes in our country's history, almost none of them have happened in those schools, right? So we have these intense measures to surveil children and punish children who are where in the schools where we're not actually experiencing that kind of violence. It's mostly in the suburban schools with majority white student populations where those instances occur. Thank you.
Great, Maryam. Thanks very much. I'm really glad you're doing this work.
Thank you.
There's some stuff that a former colleague of mine, Joe Stewart, did on racial disparities in who is punished for what, that I think you will find very interesting.
Thank you, Bill. I look forward to that.
Okay, well, thanks very much. Our next presenter is Fabiano Amorim, who is going to be presenting on hitting insulin resistance. Fabiano.
All right, thank you, Bill. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone is doing well. Let me just share my screen with you, and then we're going to start. Can you see my screen? Perfect.
Yeah, it's good.
All right, first I would like to appreciate Advance UNM for the invitation and organization of the Lightning Lounge. Just say that's a great honor to be presenting here with other people and learning more about the research of my peers. My plan today with the 7 minutes that I have available is talk about insulin resistance, and then talk about the past and current research projects that I'm involved here at UNM, and also from the previous institution that I have been working. Let's start talking about what is insulin resistance. I know that some people are not from the medical field. I just want to introduce that to you. It's a condition when cells in your muscles, fat, and liver don't respond well to insulin. And usually we see that as like a blood glucose dysregulation. And just to put this like in the easy way to understand, let's say that you have like a nice dessert. And then this dessert, when you ingest, goes to your bloodstream, the sugar that's contained there. And then your pancreas sense this increase in blood glucose. And then we have the release of insulin. And then the insulin has a role in several tissues in your blood, in your body, that increase glucose uptake. Let me just put in my laser pointer. Then these tissues, they are insulin sensitive, as we call, and then they uptake glucose from the bloodstream. But in the condition of insulin resistance, it's like we have a shield, and then the insulin does not do the job to allow glucose to get into those tissues. And we know that there is association between obesity and type 2 diabetes. And it seems that insulin resistance is, I would say, the cause of type 2 diabetes. Usually people that have type 2 diabetes, they have a certain level of insulin resistance. And we see when people they gain weight, insulin resistance increase. I have been working in the previous years, like since 2011, trying to understand what is the effect of exercise insulin resistance. Of course, this is a field that there are like several other researchers, I would say probably like 100 or more that have been studying this field. And I have been interested, I would say my main interest is to understand how exercise change insulin resistance in the muscle. And I have done like previous studies that we have investigated like an acute bout of exercise. Like acute bout is when you do like one bout of exercise and seeing what happened in the muscle. We have done like studies with like exercise training and seeing what's happened when we expose obese people with insulin resistance to exercise. And basically we use like a technique called muscle biopsy. We get a piece of the muscle and then we analyze like proteins and enzymes that are related to certain pathways related to inflammation, and we see what happened. But there is something that has been intriguing me, especially in the last like year or two, that although we know a lot about exercise, we know like a lot about the molecular pathway, etc., how exercise change, but we don't see much people exercising. And then when we ask people why they don't exercise, usually they say, oh, I don't have time to do it. I have difficult accessing facilities, like for example, gym, it's expensive. And sometimes they say they have low motivation. And 2 years ago, I tried to make my research more applied. And then I had an idea with a grad student to put a research project that we are interested to investigate the effect of high intensity intermittent stair climbing program. And this was interesting. I used to go to the College of Education, that's where my department is from. And I take the stairs. And I start to visualize people that are in that building doing exercise, doing high intensity exercise. When I say the high intensity exercise, it's basically instead of you walk, let's say you jog or run, depending on your physical conditioning, or if you are climbing stairs, you just go a little bit faster. And I put it a research project. I searched for funds. I got like funding from New Mexico IMBRI. And then we put this project. We started in the end of 2019. But unfortunately, due to COVID, we had to stop in March 2020, last year. And then, of course, this had impact like in the number of subjects that I was able to recruit. I had like 8 subjects during the period of collecting data, and I had to pause the study. And then when I stopped the study, I start to think again, now people are working remotely. People are working on their home environment. They don't have access to stairs very often. How can I make this, I would say, exercise program for someone that's working at home? And then we came with this idea to use what we call like calisthenics or body weight exercise. And also using the deliver this remotely. And I put it like a project last July or August. We submitted to the IRB. We had our lab approved to have people come in doing research. And we collect data with healthy individuals. Why healthy individuals? I was interested to see if I was able to get a high intensity interval training using this body weight exercise. And we got very interesting results. And we actually found that it's not the same doing high intensity interval exercise, but the body weight exercise kind of get very close to that. And I have a video to show you how is this protocol. And basically it's like march in place, air squat, step backs, lunge with air, and more modified burpees. And we, of course, we're not going to expose sedentary people, obese people directly with those type of exercise, but we can adjust the exercise which has less jumping component, and also adjust the intensity and the timing of the exercise. And that's what I'm engaging on. We are planning to start this study in the next month. Yeah, and then that's what I have been doing to transition my research to a more remote approach. And I just want to acknowledge the people that have been involved. This has started in Brazil before I got here at UNM, and I have continued doing this work for the last, I'd say, 8 years, so on. And I appreciate the opportunity to present here. I'm open for questions.
Great, thanks very much, Fabiano. Very interesting work. Let me get my participants list up. Is it okay if I shut down the screen share
Yep.
so I can see everybody? And open for questions. While we're waiting for others to jump in, I guess one question I had, Fabiano, is there some possibility that sort of the the lack of access to equipment and locations, et cetera, that we've all experienced during the pandemic could end up being a good thing in the long run for people who depend on exercising at home. Because I mean, I've just watched what my kids have done and what I've ended up doing, and there's a lot of creativity that's been happening that might, I don't know, somehow lower those barriers to exercise for people who tend not to.
I think in the perspective of research, yes, because it made us to think opportunities outside of the box that we are usually exposed. But we are going to be suffering, and I would say, we're going to have to pay back something that we were exposed for the last year. That's being confined at home, especially kids. And I would say the population in general. Just so you have an idea, like in 2030, before COVID, we were expecting to have half of the American population obese. And we probably accelerate this process. Today, we have 38% of the adults in the US with obesity. And yeah, I hope we can think outside the box and make those easier things more approachable for people. But based on our actual situation, I don't know how we can make like an impact in our society that would be changing those things that we are seeing, like obesity and diabetes and chronic disease that we know that are spiking in our society. And of course, due to COVID, is getting much worse.
Yeah, okay. So I'm trying too hard to find the silver lining here, I think. Yeah, thanks for that. Len Kravitz, you have a question, go ahead.
Yes, Dr. Amorim, we know there's no cure for diabetes, but if someone does have insulin resistance and does exercise, will they be able to rid themselves of the insulin resistance?
Thank you, Len. That's a great question. Yes, it's I would say, is a factor or a condition that can easily change. When people goes to the next level, that's type 2 diabetes, things has already started and it's very hard to come back. But I would say this is the insulin condition, or the insulin resistance condition, is the condition that people they got like weight, they are sedentary, and little things make, I would say, great change in this person's body if they change that. And when people already have diabetes, certain diseases are already established, like cardiovascular disease, even like neural disease, and then exercise is very beneficial. But you can improve, but you cannot go back and say you're a health person, you already have a condition established. There are certain research, certain studies today that showing that you can cure diabetes type 2, especially restricting food and increasing exercise. But it has not been, I would say, something that we see for the entire population. It's probably a small groups, a cohort, that they have seen this change.
Thank you so much.
Yes, I would like to add something. I'm Dr. Angelica Maria Koch, and apart from teaching at the UM, I'm a doctor of natural medicine. I have a full-time practice, so I see this condition a lot. And in terms of insulin resistance, if it can be cured, the idea is basically that the nutrients cannot basically assimilated or cannot penetrate through the cell wall. And therefore the cell is lacking the nutrients in order to produce energy, for example, which we call ATP. So the insulin resistance is really, in the way how to heal it is to take care of the cellular biology. So around the cell membrane, usually we have a lot of toxicity. And the cell membrane is a really big factor here. So with supplements, for example, we are able to alleviate the toxic input on the cell membrane. So therefore, nutrients can actually penetrate through the cell wall and go to the mitochondria where the energy is actually produced. So today we talk about 80% of our diseases today are mitochondrial diseases because as I said, the nutrients cannot penetrate through the cell wall. And that is a subject which has to do with nutrition, the environmental toxins, our mental emotional toxicity, all of that adds to this onslaught of poisoning today. And as very well said, diet is a huge part here, particularly with managing diabetes too. So that was just my small little input here.
Yeah, I agree with your comment on we have done like certain studies with insulin resistance in this population specifically, and we see a mitochondrial dysfunction. But it's not the lack of nutrients, it's actually the excess of fat. And it seems that they cannot handle, like especially obese individuals, they cannot handle the excess fat that's in the bloodstream, and then they don't process that. And then that's the benefit of exercise. If you activate this system, you are better on processing this macronutrients. And then you have the flow of energy, as you're saying, like ATP, better established in the cell. Yeah, and then just the last thing, we probably have over 50% of our population, I would say, there's a guess, probably like 50 to 60% of our population with insulin resistance today, and no one talk about that because we don't test. We just test blood glucose. And then when you check your blood glucose is fine. But to handle blood glucose in normal levels, you have to secrete a lot of insulin. And then that put it like a burden in the pancreas, and then that's the next level. The pancreas starts to fail, and then you have type 2 diabetes, and you need to have exogenous insulin. And just you have idea, every single person with diabetes in the US costs to the healthcare system $10,000 a year. We're talking every person, that's 12% of our population, has $1,000 a month of almost $1,000 a month of cost in terms of healthcare. And if we keep continuing the way that we are doing, that will be a very, I would say, alarming problem for our healthcare system.
Great. Thanks very much, Fabiano. Yeah, a lot to think about there, and it's good. I'm glad you're working on those issues, given the magnitude. So thanks very much. Next presenter is Jason Moore, Associate Professor in the Honors College. He'll be presenting on The Present is Not the Key to the Past, Fossil Preservation on Megafans. Jason, take it away.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah, you sound good. Go ahead.
Excellent. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about a new framework that some colleagues at UNM and I have developed to better understand fossil preservation in terrestrial environments, so on land, and hopefully much more accurately interpret past ecosystem changes. This work is sort of in its early stages, but I'm really excited about its potential, and I'm really happy to be able to share it with you today. So thank you for the invitation. First off, like, why do we even care about ecosystem changes millions of years ago anyway? You know, dinosaurs are cool and all, but given that we can't directly study these changes, whereas we can go to diverse modern ecosystems and study their changes, what else does the fossil record tell us? Well, fortunately, it gives us a couple of different perspectives that studying modern ecosystems can't. So it allows us to access much longer timescales of ecological change, evolutionary change, that modern ecosystems don't. And it also gives us the ability to study conditions that don't have analogues in the modern day or in the recent past, which, given that we're very concerned about how rapidly our ecosystems are changing nowadays and could in the future, it provides us an excellent opportunity to look at similar cases in the past. One big problem with this is that terrestrial paleoecologists at least face when attempting studies of these kinds, is that we don't really have a good model to understand how the processes of preservation of fossils vary with ancient environment. And because we don't understand these biases, it's really difficult to confidently compare the ecosystem structure of different fossil assemblages from different places and different times, and sort of actually get a handle on the ecological processes that we're really interested in. So several years ago, I was having some discussions with Gary Weissman, who's a professor in Earth and Planetary Sciences, and we realized that some of his work might provide an avenue to solve some of these paleoecological problems. So most of the modern studies of terrestrial fossil preservation are focused in the types of environment that are most common on the Earth's surface today, or in the land. So tributary river systems like the Mississippi here, where rivers join up and get larger as you move downstream, and eventually the river empties into the ocean. Now Gary's work from the last few years has suggested that actually when we look at the rock record, most of these rocks from terrestrial realms were deposited by a different type of river system that's much less common on the surface of the Earth today, that you can see on the right here, which is a distributive system where fans of sediment basically fill sedimentary basins, which are the parts of the Earth's surface where rocks form that will actually survive for geologically long periods of time. And we began developing a framework for fossil preservation in distributive systems. And at a large scale, this diagram sort of summarizes what that framework looks like. As a river enters a sedimentary basin on the left-hand side of the picture here, it has pretty high energy. It's a large river, and it will only deposit the largest particles that it's transporting. As we move further away from that entry point, the river sort of splits repeatedly, and each of its channels is smaller, has less energy, and will transport progressively smaller and smaller particles and deposit the remainder. And so we get these trends as we move from the entry point to the basin away in decrease in particle size and hence fossil size, decrease in transport distance of fossils as the energy in the system wanes, and a shift from deposition in sort of drier environments towards the entry point into the basin to wetter environments as the finer sediments in more distal environments become more waterlogged. They transmit less of the fluid, less surface flow through themselves. And so as the distributive system, also, well, another important point is as this fan system fills its sedimentary basin, these environments, all these environments will migrate outwards from the entry point. And so at any one point within the basin, as we look sort of vertically through the stacks of rocks that we're studying, you'll get a transition from these distal to these proximal environments in the basin. Now, we've recently extended this model to add a little bit more context about some specific local environments in a distributive system and the preservational processes associated with each of them. So these are satellite images of the Taquari fan, which is just off the Andes. And you can see it's sort of the order of 200, 250 kilometers in size. And we've identified 8 different sub-environments here that we would expect to see in pretty much all of these fan environments. And we've developed some ideas about how these environments might relate to one another. One of Gary's students, who I think is actually in the Zoom call at the moment, Keely, has done some really fantastic work looking at these deposits out in northwestern New Mexico, looking at terrestrial deposits there, and we see exactly the same kinds of environments and relationships of environments that we would expect to see based on the model that we've produced. So at least the rocks are telling us that our hypothesis is relatively solid. And when we look at the depositional characteristics of those rocks that Keely has been looking at, we've actually been able to predict the expected style and modifications to fossil assemblages associated with each environment, both in terms of sort of the density of fossils, how many we find in each environment, the temporal and the spatial spans that the assemblages that we were looking at would cover, and how affected by sort of post-mortem modification those fossils would be. And if our predictions hold up to like extensive testing, this will be a super exciting and impactful finding, because it will really increase our confidence to study ecological change between fossil assemblages from different places and times. So basically unlock a window that the fossil record provides to better study long-time scale, non-analog ecological change. We've made a start on some of these tests, and here are some data about the project from from a group of my students who are working here. For those of you who aren't familiar looking at geological data, time basically starts at the bottom here and works towards the top. And you can see that, wrapping up very quickly, you can see that these abundances of these species that we're looking at change directionally through time, or at least some of them do. So it looks like our preliminary data are supporting these secular changes that we would expect to see with our hypothesis. We were hoping to try this out to do some ground truthing in Paraguay last summer, but obviously 2020 bit, so that's going to have to wait for a future season when life is a little bit safer to travel out there, looking at modern fan environments. So yeah, thank you to everybody who's been involved in this project and developing these new ideas, and I'm happy to welcome any questions.
Great, thanks, Jason. Very interesting stuff. So Mary Jo Daniel is fast on the draw, and she's got her hand up. Mary Jo, go ahead.
Sorry, Bill. Well, first is a comment that one of the greatest things about these lightning lounges are the incredible variety of ways data are displayed. Each discipline has its own unique formulation of data. Jason, I know you said you're near the beginning of this. Have you had a chance to present your theoretical model in any kind of conference or format, so you can do others know about this cool work, is where I'm getting to.
So yeah, we've had a few presentations on this in a range of different venues. I was actually able to present to the sort of the hardcore taphonomists, scientists interested in the preservation of fossil assemblages at TAFCon 2020 at the end of last year, which I hadn't been to before, but we got some really interesting feedback. It's sort of there's been a search for a long time for this kind of universal taphonomic model to try and unite all the observations we're making in the terrestrial realm, and there hasn't been much success so far, but the conversations that I've had with various of my colleagues who are beginning to get to know this, actually everyone's quite excited by this idea. It's, Gary's ideas have taken the sedimentology world by storm, and we're a few years behind with paleontology, but hopefully soon.
So it's the grand unified theory of fossils.
of fossil preservation in most terrestrial environments. I won't try and overreach too much.
Thank you.
So Jason, can you explain a little bit? Was there a greater tendency at certain points in Earth's history for distributive river systems as opposed to the I forget what the term you used for them, but sort of aggregating river systems that we see, such as the Mississippi Basin?
Yeah, tributary systems. Yeah. So that's a really good question. I would say we're still at the point that we are trying to do a good census of the rock record to try and understand how these, if there are any patterns in distribution of tributary versus distributive systems. You know, when you look at all sedimentary basins on the surface of the Earth today are dominated by these fan systems, like period. And so pretty much all the systems that we have looked at in the rock record seem to fit with like one or other variation of the fan model. But, you know, there aren't that many groups who are thinking this way at the moment, and we've only looked at a limited range of the rock record so far. So, you know, signs are good, but there hasn't really been enough work carried out for me to sort of pin my colors to that flag, absolutely.
Okay, thanks. Any other questions for Jason? Well, as always, I think one of the amazing things about this session is how it showcases the incredible variety of work that faculty at UNM are doing. I want to thank all four of you for presenting. This is super interesting to me, and I really appreciate getting to know a little bit about what you all do. So thanks very much. See everybody in March.